So this is the AyaNeo 2 and this is the AyaNeo Geek. Two handhelds, both of them capable of gaming performance way ahead of Steam Deck, and that's kind of interesting, right? Recently Oliver put together a video showcasing a range of games that are quote unquote too big for Steam Deck, and of course one of the key concerns about the handheld going forward is the extent of its future-proofing on more demanding games as we emerge from what I've often referred to as the cross-gen malaise. AyaNeo 2 and its Geek counterpart are based on AMD's Ryzen 7 6800U, designed for laptops, repurposed here for a handheld, and what you're seeing are just a few of the gaming feats I've achieved with it. God of War, forget 800p at 30 FPS provided by the Steam Deck. It's possible to get pretty close to a PS4-like 1080p 30, suggesting that this handheld is comparable to a machine in a completely different power bracket to the deck. How about Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered at 1080p 30 as well? I'd say this is actually better than the PS4 version in many respects, not least because it's based on a version of the game designed initially for PlayStation 5. Doom Eternal at 1080p, 60 frames per second, no problem. The list of feats goes on, right? Forza Horizon 5, 1080p 30, gorgeous. None of these games are running at low settings or anything like that. The extra power of the AyaNeo 2 and the Geek opens the door not just to docked play, but also to handheld too, as we'll be examining later on in this video. Now, you might remember back in the day that we had some trouble getting Unreal Engine 5's Lumen and Nanite running on Steam Deck consistently at 720p, but extra horsepower definitely helps in that scenario, right? And yeah, this is indeed running hardware accelerated ray tracing on a handheld, as is the case here with Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition. How about kicking in RT features on Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, broadly equivalent to the PlayStation 5's Performance RT mode? Well, as you'll see later on in this video, we've done that too. Games that Steam Deck struggles with, like Callisto Protocol and Returnal, they definitely run faster, hinting that this is a machine with more performance and maybe even longer legs than the deck when it comes to running upcoming software. And it's all down to that Ryzen 7 6800U. Stack up the specs for this AMD APU against the Steam Deck equivalent, and we're looking at a night and day difference, right? Steam Deck uses a quad-core Zen 2 CPU cluster, while the 6800U actually has 8 cores, 16 threads, on a revised, more modern architecture, and with higher potential boost clocks. The GPU side of the equation is also much improved. The 8 RDNA 2 compute units in the deck give way to 12 of them in the 6800U, with a max clock of 2.2 GHz up against the 1.6 in the Valve handheld. So on paper then, it's a whitewash in favour of the 6800U. But the APU power range of the Vanguard chip in the deck ranges from 4 to 15 watts, and that rises massively in the 6800U to a 15 to 22 watt range, although the AyaNeo handhelds here can run at lower and indeed higher TDPs if you so wish. This strongly suggests that while the 6800U will be more powerful, you'll need to use more energy to get that performance, which means lower battery life. The AyaNeo handhelds attempt to mitigate this with a bigger battery. The 40 watt-hour battery in the deck gives way to a mammoth 50.25 watt-hour battery in the products that we're reviewing today. So AyaNeo 2, AyaNeo Geek. You might be wondering what the difference actually is. Well, both are premium handhelds, let's make no bones about it. But the Geek has lower spec alternatives you can choose to lessen the hit on your wallet. Both ship with a 1200p screen, for example, but the Geek offers an 800p cheaper alternative. AyaNeo 2 has a PCIe Gen 4 NVMe SSD, the Geek has Gen 3. Also, the gyros and haptics in the Geek have a lower spec too, but I couldn't really tell the difference in that regard, and I'd be happy with either of these machines, to be honest. And both come with a range of different options. I tested both for this review with a 2TB SSD and 32 gigs of LPDDR5 6400. Yeah, 16 and 32 gig variants are available. And I've got to say, the handheld itself is of a simply beautiful design, whether you're looking at the AyaNeo 2 or the Geek. It's really hard to fault just about anything with this thing. Smaller than Steam Deck, just as easy to hold, if not easier. Excellent analog sticks, logically placed buttons. It's an impressive device. The display is really impressive too, measuring in at 7 inches. No OLED here, alas, but it's an impressive IPS screen with deep blacks, rich colour reproduction, and remarkable brightness. The 1200p screen may be considered overkill for a handheld, but it is possible to make use of that real estate. The Radeon 680M integrated graphics in this thing are highly capable, as you'll see throughout this video. For games that do run well at 1080p or 1200p, the ultra-fine resolution on a 7-inch screen can produce a remarkable result, but 800p equally fine. More useful are the range of USB-Cs on AyaNeo 2 and Geek. You get 2 at the top and 1 at the bottom. 2 of them have full USB 4 bandwidth to get the best from an external GPU hookup if you want to go down that route, but ultimately just having more I/O options is extremely welcome when you're used to just one USB-C option on the deck. MicroSD and headphone jack are also included, naturally. I was also supplied with the optional dock, which offers HDMI 2.0 output, 2 USB-Cs and 2 Type-As. What's interesting about this is that the main USB-C docking port at the front is fully movable, meaning this was as useful for my AyaNeo Air as it was for the AyaNeo 2 and the Geek. So the overall package here is a win. The specs are incredibly impressive, and as you've already seen, the performance of the 6800U is a clear leap above what we've been able to achieve with Steam Deck. But just how much more capable is it? In my AyaNeo Air review, I benchmarked the deck in Windows mode up against the Air's older Vega-based graphics to deliver a like-for-like comparison of the silicon, both with VSync disabled, standard benchmarking procedure. And I was going to do the same for the AyaNeo 2 and the Geek, only to discover that VSync off with an external display doesn't seem to be working properly, even with the handheld display turned off. At 720p, tearing only occurs at the bottom of the screen, leading to wacky frame times. That's not how VSync off should present. At 1080p, we get results like this. Yes, there is full screen tearing, but the timing is still off, and this stutter isn't great. So this could be a driver bug, but suffice it to say, AyaNeo Air and Steam Deck both works fine. It's not a capture issue either, so I could see the problem on my 4K display too. VSync on though, everything works as it should, and that's how I'm going to bench, especially as on the handheld screen, the portrait origins of the display mean that VSync off tearing presents horizontally, looking pretty bad, like columns of gameplay running with a time offset. Not only that, but Steam Deck operates with VSync on as standard anyway in SteamOS, meaning that this is more a benchmark of the experience as opposed to the unbounded capabilities of the silicon. So let's kick off then, but before we do, a word on AyaSpace, the default launcher. Scans your hardware for your installed games, no matter whether they're under Steam, GOG or the Epic Games Store or whatever, and you can launch them all from here. You can reconfigure the inputs, tweak RGB effects on the sticks, and even examine your specs. Most interesting and indeed useful is the ability to change the TDP limit of the processor. You can go lower than 15 watts, but you power starve the processor if you do so, and limit performance severely. But you can go higher. 22 watts is described as game mode, while a Pro option lets you go all the way up to 33 watts. Power defines in-game frame rates, as we'll see, so let's take a look at that. This is Forza Horizon 5, benchmarked at 15, 22, 26 and 33 watts, on the same high settings at 1080p with FSR2 quality mode engaged. There's a big boost to performance moving from 15 to 22 watts here. 46% more power gets you 33% higher frame rates on average across the bench, but you'll also note the tight grouping on the higher wattages. 26 watts represents a circa 19% of extra power over 22 watts, but you're only getting 8% more performance. The difference between 26 and 33 watts amounts to statistical noise in this benchmark, meaning that there's no reason whatsoever to run at 33 watts at all. My impression from this though is that 15 watts should be considered for less challenging games, 22 watts is the sweet spot for handheld play, which I guess is why it's called game mode in AyaSpace, while 26 watts or 33 is good for potential docks play with the system plugged in. So is there any reason to run at 33 watts at all based on this test? Perhaps not, but I did note differences in other titles. For example, in Returnal here, 33 watts versus 26 watts offers a circa 6% improvement when stacked up against 15. That drops to around 3% in Control and just 1% in A Plague Tale Requiem. In all scenarios though, it's the jump from 15 to 22 watts that offers the best bang for the buck. For the rest of my performance tests, I'm going to drop the 33 watt tests from the results because it's really not that interesting. Instead, I'm going to swap in SteamOS on Steam Deck, running the same benchmarks at the same settings. The deck is hard limited to 15 watts, but I can tell you from the review period when TDP was open that scaling beyond 15 watts is barely worth it. Still, returning to Forza Horizon 5 here, you can see what we're doing. You can stack up AyaNeo 2 and its Geek counterpart at 3 different wattages against the deck at its static 15. Going back to Forza Horizon, you can see that at 720p with 4 times MSAA, the AyaNeo 2 at 22 watts and 26 watts gets pretty close to locking to 60 frames per second, meaning a hard ceiling to our tests that would influence performance differentials. So that's why I've also benched at 1080p FSR2 quality mode, which is again native 720p, but adds extra loads to the GPU via anti-aliasing and in the upscaling process to Full HD. In the 15 watt head-to-head, AyaNeo versus Steam Deck, the difference in silicon and operating system gives the new handheld a 9 percentage point lead. That's not a huge advantage, bearing in mind the vastly improved silicon. Truth is that extra power is needed to get more from the more capable chip. At 22 watts, you're getting a 45% advantage performance-wise over the Steam Deck, rising to 57% at 26 watts. Remedy's control is intriguing because in my experience, the open source Radeon driver used in SteamOS gives better performance than Windows, and so in the 15 watt face-off between AyaNeo and Deck, the Deck actually wins overall with a 2.8 percentage point lead on average across the bench. Move up to 22 watts though and it's a 32% advantage to the AyaNeo handhelds, rising to 37% at 26 watts. Again, I'm running this at medium settings to depress performance actually, to remain beneath 60 FPS, because the AyaNeo 2 can easily hit 60 on low settings, and I'd recommend that actually, because truth is there's not much difference visually. Doom Eternal again highlights how well all handhelds run this game, and at 720p on high settings, the AyaNeo is mostly locked to 60 FPS with only minor dips, at the higher wattages at least. But it's interesting to note that in the 15 watt shootout, AyaNeo versus Deck, the Valve handheld is way ahead. We need to run at 1080p to get some idea of scaling, where again, the more efficient SteamOS driver sees the Deck beat the AyaNeo with a 3-point lead at a matched 15 watts. However, more power means more performance. A 29-point lead at 22 watts over the Deck, in favour of the AyaNeo of course, rising to 34% at 26 watts. God of War here is more on trend however. At 15 watts, the AyaNeo handhelds beat the Steam Deck running under SteamOS by around 7%. More power delivers more perf though, as you may imagine, so 22 watts means a 38 percentage point lead, rising to 44% at 26 watts. We're benching here on original settings, which is essentially the same as the PlayStation 4's visual feature set. So we'll be running some interesting handheld versus console comparisons further on in this video. Let's round off the performance benchmarks with a couple of games that historically have really caused issues for the Steam Deck: A Plague Tale Requiem and Returnal. Looking at low settings here at 720p on balanced resolution, so TAAU upscaling from 504p essentially, the numbers on the intro cutscene look pretty good, right? Steam Deck averages at 36 FPS for example. Well, I'd say that flatters to deceive compared to actual gameplay, but even so, it's a 7-point lead for AyaNeo versus Deck at 15 watts, rising to 35% when we unleash 22 watts, and rising again to a 42 percentage point lead at 26 watts. And that's a lot of extra performance to play with in a really challenging game that Steam Deck barely copes with during gameplay. Returnal, bear in mind that PlayStation 5 renders internally at 1080p before upscaling to 4K, and that the PS5 version is broadly equivalent to the PC version running on a hybrid of high and epic settings. This is going to be a daunting challenge for a handheld. Here we're running with 720p on FSR1 quality mode. meaning circa 480p internally actually. Some interesting variations in results this time, with the 15-watt shootout delivering a big 14 percentage point lead for the AyaNeo, making me think that perhaps the CPU is having some say in the argument here. This rises to 39% at 22 watts, then 44% at 26 watts. So that's a significant advantage for the AyaNeo in a game that truly struggles on Valve's competing handheld. So let's try to draw some conclusions then. The Ryzen 7 6800U has over twice the potential CPU grunt, and in terms of theoretical peak performance, the RDNA 2 GPU should be over twice as powerful too. But in like-for-like tests at the same power level, 15 watts, there's no knockout blow for the 6800U. All of that potential in the silicon translates into just a circa 7 percentage point lead, and it can actually be slower. At the 22 watt sweet spot, you need to sink in 47% more power to deliver around 35% more in-game performance. Meanwhile, the battery in the AyaNeo handhelds is only 26% larger. So, do the maths here. Inevitably, that means that battery life is going to be significantly lower on the AyaNeo handhelds compared to Steam Deck. An hour 10, an hour 15, that's commonplace on a demanding game that's really pushing the power limits. I'd say there are two ways to look at this then. On the plus side, you can power your way past Steam Deck performance, and that circa 35 to 40% of extra throughput solves a lot of issues you may experience in the most challenging games run on the Steam Deck. Combine that with the hugely improved screen, and there's no doubt that the AyaNeo handhelds can deliver a better gaming experience than the Deck in many ways. The minor side is that battery life already isn't the best thing about Steam Deck, and it's worse on these new handhelds. And of course, the price for these premium components is directly handed to the user in the form of a much more expensive product. That performance though, man, it goes a long way. Part of the reason this review took so long is that I think assessing something like this takes longer than just running some benchmarks. You've got all of this extra power. The question is, what can you do with it? That's more crucial to me than assigning a percentage number on performance compared to another device. So yeah, I've spent a lot of time with the AyaNeo 2 and the Geek, and I'd like to present some highlights from my testing. All of this was carried out on the Geek at the 22 watt sweet spot on the 6800U. Performance is basically identical between the two handhelds, if that wasn't obvious. Here in Fortnite, we're running at 720p using the full UE5 feature set, micro geometry with nanite, hardware accelerated ray tracing with Lumen. We're aiming for the 30 FPS target that was elusive when I tried the same thing on Steam Deck. By using the game's replay feature, we can turn off the high-end UE5 features and use the standard fallbacks on a mixture of medium and high settings. The idea here is to forego nice-to-have features you don't really need on this game in favour of higher pixel counts and 60 FPS. The latter is obviously better for a competitive advantage in-game, but obviously detail and lighting fidelity take a big hit. There are some stuttering problems at 60 FPS, while the 30 FPS frame rate limiter obviously has poor frame pacing issues. Something I thought was fixed a long time ago in Unreal Engine, but here we go. This represents the kind of scalability inherent in the game though. You could push even higher in frame rate terms by stripping out even more features if you wanted, but I thought this was a nice balance for 1080p 60. We enjoyed some good benchmark results for Forza Horizon 5, and it's true to say that 720p with 4x MSAA at 60 frames per second is achievable on the AyaNeo 2 and the Geek for a good deal of play with few issues. In addition to the benchmark settings, I also added the long motion blur shutter speed, as I think it genuinely adds a lot to the game, especially at 30 FPS. Here you're seeing two gameplay sessions, one at 720p 60, one at 1080p 30, using Forza's own internal FPS limiter. You'll note that unlike Fortnite, 30 FPS runs with perfectly consistent frame pacing here, a clean 33.3 millisecond per frame that is essentially a lock. What I'm suggesting here is 720p for handheld play, and if you want additional clarity on a flat panel living room screen, 1080p 30 really looks great docked. You can see that in certain circumstances, 60 FPS locked is not a given, however, at 720p. Handheld devices are inherently bandwidth limited, and this means that bandwidth intensive effects can cause issues. You can mitigate this to a certain extent by paring back visual features where the impact will have far less of an issue on a handheld screen, of course. Ultimately though, I came away super impressed with how Forza presented in both gameplay scenarios here, and again, it's a class above what's achievable on Steam Deck. It is a bit of a shame we couldn't lock to 60, but remember the CPU burden is being doubled at 720p 60. Here's another head-to-head with Marvel's Spider-Man, again 720p 60 versus 1080p 30, the latter with dynamic resolution scaling active as a safety net. I'm using the medium setting as a baseline here, then dropping back crowd and traffic density. Forgot to lower depth of field in the 720p 60 feed however. It's on high there and low on 1080p, but otherwise we've got a settings lock between the two feeds. Struggled to get a consistent 40 FPS on these settings on Steam Deck at 720p, and there are similar problems getting 60 on the AyaNeo handhelds. High-speed web swinging has a particular CPU hit, and contention with similarly high GPU requirements also causes issues. So on Steam Deck, you can adjust screen frequency, anything from 40 to 60 Hz. On the AyaNeo handhelds, there is no official support for this, but there is an unofficial route to 48 Hz, and I think that's preferable to targeting 60 or indeed settling for 30. Either way, Marvel's Spider-Man plays out beautifully on the AyaNeo handhelds, and yeah, you can even use ray tracing too, something I'll take a look at later on. Now let's talk about games that have really pushed Steam Deck hard and where I'd expect the extra horsepower of the AyaNeo 2 to take us beyond the Deck's limits and into the realm of more playable frame rates. The Callisto protocol has a remarkably heavy CPU and GPU requirement, and I wasn't looking for anything better than a decent 720p 30 here, using low settings and FSR2 in balance mode. I have a decent amount of memory here though on the AyaNeo handhelds, so I opted for high textures and high texture filtering, which should have a negligible impact on performance. This one's interesting because even on low settings, the game looks really impressive. Testament to the high quality art design from the developer here. It's remarkable to see this play out on a handheld screen. But there are some issues, as you can see. 720p at 30 FPS is there, but once again, there's inconsistent frame pacing that makes it look like it's running far worse when using the game's inbuilt 30 FPS cap. Unlike the Steam Deck, there's no system level 30 FPS cap that will enforce good consistent performance. You're at the mercy of the in-game equivalent. Forza and many other titles proves that it can work, but here not so much. There are also profound issues with stutter. I'm not sure it's shader compilation stutter here, as the game does complete its pre-compiling step. So this is a case seemingly of the hardware being there, but the software falling short. That's a shame, because otherwise this is quite a remarkable handheld experience. And there are similar issues in Returnal. We've already seen the benchmark play out, and while we have had to make a lot of compromises to make this work at frame rates above 30 FPS, clearly it can be done. And something else to emphasize is that the challenging benchmark is stutter-free, but you can see that this is not the case in-game, where it seems that once again we have really bad stuttering issues. And based on my testing at least, there's no means by which the player can avert it. There's no FPS cap at all in this game, which is why we're playing unlocked. The AyaNeo handhelds don't have a 40 Hz display mode, which I reckon may have helped tame some of the consistency problems. And the 48 Hz that it does support, I think it's just too high. Even so, this still wouldn't address the stutter problems, which are the main issue here. So this is another example of a piece of software where the stutter issues we noted in our tech review have a far more profound impact on a system where resources are limited and where CPU and GPU share bandwidth. When it works rather nicely, I think. And again, I don't see this as much of a hardware problem as it is in terms of software. That's a bit of a shame, but it is what it is. And let's be clear, there is plenty of performance here, and this machine is capable of some crazily impressive things. I returned to Marvel's Spider-Man in my docked 1080p 30 configuration, kept the same settings but turned on hardware accelerated ray tracing on the high preset with object range at 6. It's kind of broadly equivalent to the RT settings in the PS5's performance RT mode, though obviously that's targeting 60, not the 30 we're looking at here. I'm also using dynamic resolution scaling based on FSR2, and I was amazed to see that I could mostly hold 30 FPS here, and I can clearly benefit from the RT reflections in the game. Just to stress, I'm still at 22 watts here. I've not downgraded any settings. I've just traded resolution for RT and used FSR2 to upscale back to 1080p. It's a perfectly playable experience, though it's interesting to note some scenarios here where FSR2 just can't keep up with the demands placed on it. Reconstructing fences and other transparencies, for example, is clearly problematic. Check out that artifacting, it's pretty blatant. Still, amazed somewhat by the consistent performance, I decided on a stress test and went straight for Times Square, where, yeah, frame rates start to buckle. The issue here isn't just that reflective surfaces are far more commonplace, it's also that this area in general has a high CPU burden, and you can mitigate the issue to a certain extent by dropping resolution to 720p, freeing up some resources on the GPU, but it's still not a lock to 30 FPS. Even so, I remain impressed by what a handheld is doing here. Really interesting stuff. Now, regular viewers may recall that I managed to get Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition playable at circa 30 FPS on the Steam Deck running Windows, so it should come as no surprise to see that it's possible, and with fewer compromises, on the AyaNeo handhelds as well. Again, we're limiting to 30 FPS here, and again you'll note that 4A's frame rate limiter does a good job of delivering a consistent level of frame pacing. We're using high settings here along with high RT, 2x variable rate shading and no tessellation, hairworks or advanced physics. Some parts of the game play out just fine at 720p 30, while others require dropping internal resolution scaling to 0.8 or 0.9. Again, it's a shame that the dynamic resolution scaling technique used extensively on the console versions isn't deployed in the PC build. Even so, amazing RT-based global illumination on the handheld is a remarkable achievement in my opinion. I was blown away at getting it working on Steam Deck, but here we're able to do it with fewer performance drops and higher resolution overall. I'm going to end with a couple more comparisons I made. Back in the Steam Deck review video, we saw how God of War on the deck at 800p and 720p was broadly comparable, if not a bit faster, than the PlayStation 4 version running at 1080p. Well, with the extra power of the Ryzen 7 6800U, the gap has closed significantly. Original settings here on the AyaNeo as close as we're going to get to PS4 rendering. 15 watts is nowhere near enough to get a decent comparison. Like for like, we're looking at about 60.5% of PS4 throughput, but 22 watts upwards is where things are much more interesting. Across the length of the sequences I captured here, 6800U at 22 watts delivers 88.7% of the PS4's throughput, which rises to 95.8% at 26 watts and 97.8% at 33 watts. Just one game being tested here, obviously, but it's an interesting result, I feel. Now, I mean, in theory, a 2023 handheld should be beating a 2013 console, but we should remember that PS4 was a bandwidth beast. Here's another fun comparison. This area of A Plague Tale Requiem also falls beneath 40 FPS in its 40 FPS mode on a PS5, and we can precisely match settings on PC and thus the AyaNeo 2. 4K output here on PS5, but upscaling internally from 1440p via TAAU. We can match the proportion of upscaling on PC too, but its visual impact gets more severe the lower down the resolution chain we go. Even so, in like-for-like settings, the AyaNeo 2 at 33 watts has 27% of the PS5's throughput in this match scenario, which is kind of nuts. You can see the rest of the performance differentials there, right down to 720p, which gets to about 91% of the PS5's frame rate. Just one section tested in just one game, but a fun test nonetheless, which leads me on to my last gameplay test. A Plague Tale Requiem, of course, a game that just about managed to work on Steam Deck, but did encounter issues. Got to say that I was really impressed watching this game play out on settings I chose with a view to getting as close to a locked 30 FPS as possible using the in-game performance limiter. I went for low settings in the end at 720p resolution with a balanced resolution scaling. However, I added in high textures because I'm not short of memory, and I also opted to include contact shadows on low that are missing, that are turned off on the actual low preset. The initial stage of the game is quite heavy actually. It drops beneath 40 FPS in its 40Hz fidelity mode on PS5, but it plays out very smoothly here at the target 30. Not only that, but other graphical gotchas on consoles still run nicely on the AyaNeo 2. Oh, and to stress, here I'm at 22 watts, not the 33 of the benchmark earlier. Anyway, fiery scenes, no problem at all. I was also happy to see that the village and market scenes found at the beginning of the second chapter played out just fine too. The amount of NPCs here causes CPU challenges for the Steam Deck, but the AyaNeo's extra horsepower seems to iron out any untoward issues we might have faced here. Still, even so, I've still got some reservations about whether titles designed for the 9th generation consoles will scale to these AMD-based handhelds going forward, and right now Unreal Engine games still seem to have issues. However, A Plague Tale Requiem scales well and still manages to look gorgeous on the handheld screen, running very nicely. A really nice way to end the testing for this video, I think. So, with that in mind, let's sum up. I love the device, I love what it can do, but it's important to point out that there are weaknesses here. To beat Steam Deck conclusively, you literally need to power past the limits of the Valve hardware. You need more power, and the increase in battery capacity you get only goes so far. So yes, battery life is an issue, and I still can't help but think that SteamOS support would help these Windows machines. And to be fair, Valve has made it clear that it does want to bring the new wave of 6800U devices into the family, so to speak. A superior interface, bespoke modifications for RDNA 2 handhelds, hopefully better power management. Can't see it being a bad thing at all, and yeah, looking forward, I'll be interested to see how AMD tops the 6800U. The next gen APUs should have access to a far superior process node for the chip, which means either better efficiency, more performance, or both, though I do note that the announced Phoenix Point processors are targeting a higher power budget than the 6800U, so that may not help handhelds like this. In the meantime though, while not the mainstream slam dunk that Steam Deck is, there's much to commend this brace of AyaNeo products, and I suspect that the power user will enjoy what they do, both as handhelds and as docked devices. I'm going to continue following the progress of this company because the quality of their devices is top-notch, simply remarkable. But that's it from me for now. Like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed the content, and of course ring any and all bells on this page for instant notifications when new DF videos drop. And yeah, please do explore the DF supporter program for high quality video downloads, early access, bonus materials, and much more. But that's it. That really is the end of this mammoth video. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of it, assuming that you did, and just generally thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.